into the Sunday Journal. I'm your host, Matt Pitta. Always great to have you with us here. We get together each week to talk about issues facing the Cape, the islands, and all of southeastern Massachusetts. If you make a list of top 10 issues that we deal with on a regular basis, it is erosion, coastal erosion, and how we as a community collectively here on Cape Cod are dealing with it. If you've been listening to and reading our news coverage online at capecod.com and on our radio stations, you know we've been talking quite a bit about what's happening in Sandwich right now when it comes to Town Neck Beach. In fact, there's an important town meeting coming up in which the town is going to have to readdress the issue of some funding for replenishing Town Neck Beach with dredge spoils from the Cape Cod Canal. And it really brings up the larger issue of what's going on when it comes to the issue of erosion here on Cape Cod. There's a project that's underway that's involving, appropriately enough, Sandwich and the town of Barnstable that the Center for Coastal Studies in Provincetown is involved with. And we brought into studio to talk about this Dr. Mark Borelli. He is a coastal geologist and an associate scientist and the director of the seafloor mapping program at the Center for Coastal Studies out there in Provincetown. Doctor, good to meet you here in studio. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. The issue here, talking about coastal erosion, we wanted to talk about it in general, but specifically we're going to start out with this project that Barnstable and Sandwich have teamed up with that is taking a look at really that whole stretch of beach, I guess we could say from the canal all the way down to pretty much the tip of Sandy Neck. Is that an appropriate, almost to the tip of Sandy Neck pretty much?
Sure, no, we're going to be going into it and beyond a little bit too, just to make sure we got it all, sure.
So we wanted to talk a little bit about what this project is, what you folks are going to be doing between now and, you say, the end of June of 2016, taking a look at the, I guess, the conditions, et cetera. So I'll let you take it from here, Mark. Talk to me about this project involving both of these towns when it comes to taking a look at the erosion picture out there.
Sure. Well, we've got a one-year grant from the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management to develop a sediment budget for this stretch of shoreline. And we're going to go from the Cape Cod Canal into Barnstable Harbor, and we'll go a little bit beyond toward Dennis and Brewster. And what we want to do is we want to try and estimate how much sand is moving along the shoreline. And we do that by generating a sediment budget, and it's a lot like a household budget. You want to know how much money is coming into your house and how much money is going out, so you can make plans for what you need to do and what you can expect. So a lot of places, a lot of towns will manage their coast and not really have a good understanding or a quantitative understanding of how much sand actually moves along that beach. So this project will look to sort of quantify the amount of sand that moves through that area, starting from the canal all the way past Barnstable, past Sandy Neck, and even into the harbor.
Now, how did this come about? The two towns get together, and were they looking to find a way to look at what's going on in their beaches? We know that Town Neck obviously has been ravaged in many years. Sandy Neck took a hard hit in many of the recent storms. So how did this all come about?
Dr. Graham Guy is one of the founders of the center, has developed this mathematical model to generate these sediment budgets over the last 6-7 years. And we've been doing projects, smaller projects in and around Cape Cod Bay and even on the open ocean side. And we've had a lot of success. So when this call for grants came out from CZM, we approached the town, both towns, made some phone calls. We had a meeting, wanted to see if they were interested, because we really feel that not only are we doing some good science here, but the information that we're getting from these studies can be really helpful in managing these shorelines. And both towns were interested, and we moved forward.
Well, you bring up an interesting point, because I think it was a year ago that I was covering a story down at Sandy Neck, and it was after they really took a hit, and a corner of that parking lot was about to fall in, and they had to make some emergency repairs. So after you folks finish this study, and as you said, it's going to go through the end of June of 2016, basically then what? What's going to happen with that information, and how do you think this is going to be able to help those two communities?
Yeah. That's great questions. A couple things. One is that, again, when we talk about that household budget analogy, it's a good one, because you're going to put, Sandwich now is talking about putting a lot of sand on the beach, and it's tricky to figure out. I mean, they're going to take what they can get from the canal because it's available sediment, but you want to understand how much sand is actually moving along. So if you were to put 10 or 20,000 cubic yards of sand, if that is a fraction, a tenth of the actual sediment budget, you wouldn't expect it to last too long. If it's say 100,000 a year and you put 1 million a year, then you can have different expectations. And a lot of times, one of the problems in doing these beach replenishment projects is not understanding what you're going to get, the expectations. So this is helping the towns manage that the local expectations and trying to understand what's going to happen or what could happen. And it's just giving the town, again, more information to better manage the area.
So they'll be able to use this information as they move forward with future beach management projects in both Barnstable and Sandwich then.
Yeah, one of the things that we're doing is basically, let me just describe how we do it. What we do is we look at historical data. There's a wealth of information out there. And Cape Cod Bay, most of Cape Cod Bay was mapped in the 30s and 40s using old lead lines. These are just guys out on boats with a piece of lead that they lower down to the seafloor and make a measurement of the water depth. And they spent years going throughout all of Cape Cod Bay doing this, and it's really fascinating. And now that we're looking at these data with our new techniques and new equipment, they were really accurate. They've got a really good interpretation of the bottom. So now we can take these data and we can create surfaces using our computers and our data visualization software. And we can recreate what the surface looked like in Cape Cod Bay and along the shore from the 30s and 40s. Now we take a modern surface, and there's a number of those, and we compare the two. And this is where Graham's model comes in. We actually look at the entire coast along transects. These are lines that start, say, at the dune, and they go out to about 30 feet of water. And then we're looking at the change along that entire area. So it's not just shoreline change. It's not just looking at what the beach is doing, but it's looking at the entire coastal area. And that's really important because oftentimes what happens along the beach is not really what's happening in the larger system. But we tend to look at the beach and we tend to manage the beach, but what we're really doing is managing one section, and that can cause problems. When we did this project in Brewster, there were a few places where what was going on the coast was not at all what was happening offshore. We did a small project in Provincetown, and this is one of my favorite ones, where there was a lot of shoreline erosion on the beach, and there was a lot of accretion offshore. So this is a beach that's a natural beach. This was off near Herring Cove Beach in Provincetown. That's responding naturally. It's flattening out, basically. There's erosion occurring along the beach, and there's accretion forming offshore. So the slope of the beach is lowering, which is what you want a natural beach to do over time. So it's really important to understand what the natural beaches are doing, what these modified beaches are doing, and the entire coastal system. And that's a big part of what we're getting at.
Well, I think you bring up an interesting point, though. Those of us who are not experts like yourself, we take a look at the beach and we say, well, throw some more sand on the beach that we see and it should be okay. But what you're saying is you're thinking there's a much bigger thought process here, and that you've got to be thinking out into the water. What's going on in the water, basically, underwater?
Sure. Yeah. And I think the Brewster Flats are a good way to, a good analogy for people to think about. Imagine changing the beach on the Brewster Flats, and you're going to add a few hundred yards, a few thousand yards, but you've got these huge flats out in front of you. They're the things that are really driving change along that beach. They're the ones, if you imagine removing all those flats, hypothetically, well, that beach would change. It would be incredibly different. It would be much steeper. It would be a lot like the beaches in Sandwich. Mm-hmm. So by just altering the beach, you do very little to change what's going on, right? All the waves that are working on that beach, all the tidal currents that are working just offshore are all the same. And those are the waves and the tidal currents that have made that beach, form that beach the way it is. So just adding sand to the beach isn't going to change the drivers of the change that's occurring on the beach.
There are so many factors at play when trying to decide what to do with our beaches. So, for instance, I was just down in Eastham a couple of nights ago covering a presentation on the state of the seashore with George Price, the superintendent of the Cape Cod National Seashore, and he was talking about some reality issues, reality checks that they're facing when it comes to, I think he referred to Nauset Light Beach and some of the others, where they said, over time we're going to lose a parking lot here, we're going to have to maybe think about remote parking, and, in that situation, the management seems to be, well, we can't stop what's happening, so we'll adapt by either moving a parking lot to a different area, we'll move the stairs into a different location. In Sandwich, they seem to be dealing with a little bit of a different situation in that it's not really just about saving a beach, it's really about saving infrastructure further inland, because they have the flooding into the marsh, they're seeing flooding close to 6A, so it's a little different situation, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
They're trying to literally save potential infrastructure.
Yeah. The fact of the matter is that in the seashore, as tough as George's job is, and it's very tough, he's lucky that he doesn't have a lot of the houses and the infrastructure right along the beach. So he has a very natural coastline, and it's just allowed to erode. I mean, they have to account for stairs and parking lots, but you go down to Sandwich, there's just all kinds of stuff right next to the beach.
Firehouses and police stations.
So it's entirely different. And so it has to be managed in a different way.
Now, let me ask you this, if you're just joining us, by the way, on the Sunday Journal, we're talking with Dr. Mark Borelli. He is a coastal geologist and associate scientist and the director of the seafloor mapping program with the Center for Coastal Studies in Provincetown. We're talking about a project that is involving Barnstable and Sandwich that is looking at the kind of the future of the coastline. They're doing a sediment budget analysis of what's happening, and the two towns will be able to take that information and decide how they move forward with their beach management. Now, I've learned a lot covering this story about Town Neck over the many years, Mark, and I'd like to know what your thought is on how you're going to account or deal with the fact that when you take a look at the beach system as it is now, and you look a little bit further north, as a layman, you look and you say the problem here is this huge jetty that sticks out from the canal, and when you look at the accretion of beach just to the north of that jetty, you've got a massive beach there in Sagamore, and you can see just by the eye, if you look at a Google map, you can see how all the sand's being trapped, and that sand would make its way to Town Neck Beach, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no doubt, and it's very well established that the Cape Cod Canal has changed the way Sandwich has had to deal with their coastal issues. If it weren't for the canal, you probably wouldn't be having these issues. You'd be having the same level of issues as the other towns on the Cape. And Sandwich and Barnstable just have it tough. Sandwich much tougher.
But even the jetty itself, that large jetty is trapping the sand.
Sure.
So, and obviously the fix they're hoping here is to get some of that sand out of the canal, dredge it, and throw it back onto Town Neck. But is that really, long term, what's the reality of that? It's just going to keep washing away, isn't it?
Well, no matter what happens, it's always going to be washing away because, like I said, the waves and the currents are always going to be there, and there's always going to be a certain amount of sand moving along that coast, and that's what we're trying to get at with the sediment budget. But, the Cape Cod Canal has jetties, and the jetties are doing their job. The jetty's job is to keep the sand on the north side. Right? It's not supposed to get into the jetty, into the inlet, because they'll have to dredge it more. It's not supposed to get past it. So it's supposed to keep the canal open and free from dredging, or reduce the amount of dredging. It's doing its job. Now,
but that doesn't help Sandwich.
No, it doesn't help Sandwich at all. But when these structures go in, and we talk about doing structures, it's important to understand why the structure's going in and what the effects are going to have. Because I know folks are talking about structures, and there's a reason why they're difficult to get done, because they have negative impacts. They're going to change the way sand moves along the coast. And it's absolutely true that if the inlet, if the canal wasn't there and the jetties weren't there, that Sandwich likely wouldn't be having anywhere near the amount of problems it has.
Right.
Now, there are a lot of inlets, well, not a lot, but there are quite a few inlets that have management practices such as bypass, wherein every time they dredge, they put the material downdrift. They put the material, and when I say updrift and downdrift, that's what we coastal geologists talk about directions of sediment transport. It's like upstream and downstream of a river. So the sand is moving from the north to the south. So there are a lot of inlets where when they dredge it, it's just practice that they put it on that beach. Every single drop, grain of sand that comes out there goes right onto the beach. There are systems, the Indian River Inlet in Delaware, where there's actually a pipe installed on one side, and they make it into a slurry, and a couple times whenever they need to, they just pipe it on over, and it's a smaller inlet, but there's a bridge there, and it's relatively simple. But that kind of sort of helping along and mitigating for what we've done has its benefits. But it also has its drawbacks.
If you're just joining us today on the Sunday Journal, we're talking with Dr. Mark Borelli, a coastal geologist and associate scientist and director of the Seafloor Mapping Program at the Center for Coastal Studies. We're talking about erosion. How do you factor in, will you be factoring in the issue of climate change? Do you take a look at that with this? How does that work? How does that play into this? Is it possible to determine what's been happening, what's going to happen 10 years from now?
I think it's important when you're doing these kinds of projects to do one thing at a time. So what we're going to do first is we're going to look at sediment transport. We're going to generate that rigorous quantitative number using the method that we've developed, that Graham has developed, and then start to look at implications. So the last part of the report, we'll start to look at sea level rise, different scenarios, and things like that. The project is just for developing that budget. It's a fair amount of money, but it is, it's going to be used for that kind of thing. We're not developing guidance based on our findings. This is sort of a tool that you can use when you're trying to look at that. And quite frankly, the state and agencies like CZM like science-based management. They want that science that they can rely on, rather than just anecdotal things, or let's try putting this amount of material on the beach and see what happens. So while we're not charged with doing that in this particular grant, that'll come up.
What, Mark, do you, as a scientist, do you try to make some formulations ahead of time? What do you think you're going to learn? Do you try to have a hypothesis? Okay, this is what we think we're going to find out.
Yeah.
What do you think? What do you think you're going to find out at this point?
That's a great question. As a scientist, you really try to not have preconceived notions of what you're going to find, right? You want to go in.
But it must be tough, right? I mean, it's human nature.
On a human level, we kind of know what we're going to see. I mean, Graham has been studying this Cape Cod Bay since the 1950s.
Yeah.
He's an expert. He is probably the world's leading expert on Cape Cod, really, as far as coastal geology goes. So he's got a good sense of what it is, and it's interesting that you mentioned that. So say we have findings that support what we think was going to happen. That's really dangerous, because you don't look for mistakes. If we say we're going to find 50,000 cubic yards of material going through there, and we find 15, well, that's a red flag, because it doesn't make any sense. Now, if we find 50, because it's what we thought, we had that preconceived notion that's going to be 50, we won't look for mistakes. And that's why a scientist does not want to have a preconceived notion. You want to go in there, you want to do as good a job as you can, but that preconceived notion can lead you down the wrong path.
Just a quick final question here. We're just about out of time, Mark. But obviously, Sandwich, we think, is going to be moving forward with the project for Town Neck. Is it possible that you guys get to the end of the study by the end of next June? You say, maybe that wasn't the right move. Is that at all possible? Or
I honestly, I don't think so. Of course, having just said not to have preconceived notions,
right.
I don't want to get in that.
Exactly.
But the reality is, it's a starved beach. It needs sand. So as long as it's done properly and the sand is suitable, it's probably a good idea.
Mark Borelli is a coastal geologist and associate scientist and director of the Seafloor Mapping Program with the Center for Coastal Studies in Provincetown. Mark, great information. We could talk about it forever. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Let's rally back here next year and find out how things went when this is over.
Sounds good.
I appreciate your time very much, and thanks for being with us today on the Sunday Journal. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you.
And thanks for being with us this morning. I'm your host, Matt Pitta.